pressure. The recording coming on, oh my gosh. Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Opening words today come from, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. And he offers this from his letter from Birmingham Jail. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down water like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? I think the letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King is it's American scripture as much as any document could be, along with the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address. It deserves to be read by every American over and over and over again. It's that potent, it's that powerful, it's an amazing document. It was released on April 16th, 1963, and it had been written in the margins of a local newspaper while King was locked in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. In protest efforts there to end racial segregation, he had been arrested along with many others for violating a local court order not to demonstrate. 4 days earlier, and some people don't know this, but the letter from a Birmingham jail was actually written in response to another letter that came out 4 days earlier, the day of King's arrest. And it was written by a group of eight Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish clergy, all from Alabama, releasing this letter where they, in effect, criticized King without naming him, his presence in Birmingham, and the protests in general. The letter expressed sympathy for the cause of racial justice, but rejected protest as a viable response, and blamed outsiders for the unease. This call to unity, as it was called, concluded by saying, when rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. King's letter was his response to this call to unity, and he famously uttered words that have become so very familiar to us today, such as, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And for years now I've heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. But perhaps most famously and blisteringly in this letter, King criticized what he called the white moderate. I think it's important to understand this part of Martin Luther King because it's easy to change who he was. He was a very radical person, very radical writer. He said very strong things that over time some of those strong things have gotten lost to the way that we tell his story. But he said some tough stuff, even though he said it very beautifully and this is one of those tough things that he said. He said, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been greatly disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. A little over 4 years ago, I wrote a sermon called In Recovery from White Moderation. And the sermon was based on this letter, Martin Luther King's letter, and more specifically on this quote in particular. And I delivered the sermon here on June 30th, 2019. And some of you may have actually been here where I delivered it, but I don't expect you to remember it, because I barely remember my own sermons. But I've been doing anti-racism work going back almost over 30 years. And in this sermon, I recognized how even still, even now, even after all that work, all that effort, all that thought and process, even still, every single charge King issued in that white moderation critique, I related to, I saw it in myself. The white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. How many times have I chosen to remain silent to avoid disturbing the status quo? How many calculations have I made? Should I say this? Should I do that? Is it worth it? How many times have I chosen to be polite rather than angry? The pull to avoid controversy, the pull to self-protect, the pull to let things be. Who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. How many judgments have I had about how the work gets done? Why did they kneel during the anthem? Why did they block traffic? Why did they cuss? Why did they dress scary? Why did they knock over a trash can? Why did they break a window? Why did they riot? I'm a really devout advocate of nonviolent resistance and have found myself struggling with some of the harsher forms of protest that we have seen. And at the same time, it would be super easy for me as a white man to take possession of King's words and use them to criticize people, to call for an end of their action, to dismiss their activism, to withdraw into my cozy little home. It would be super easy for me to focus on the undesirability of the protest while ignoring the very conditions that ignited the protest. Who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Why now? Why the rush? Why don't you know it doesn't work that way? You're moving too fast. I've caught within my throat this exhortation to patience. Wait, don't push too hard, too fast. You're not doing this right. You need a better strategy. It will take more time. Don't do anything. And I used recovery language in that sermon title, In Recovery from White Moderation, comparing white moderation to addiction, because no longer how long I've attempted to abstain, to step away from that safer and easier decisions, to step away from those easier and safer decisions. The impulse is always there. It remains, always tempting to pull me back in, the pull to be silent, the pull to an avoidance of conflict, the pull to control, the pull to resistance, the pull of dismissiveness, the pull to a failure of trust. I recognize that living a life outside of moderation is a moment-to-moment, day-to-day decision when choosing better one day doesn't guarantee you will do the same the next. But after delivering that sermon and also continuing to read King's letter, I noticed something was missing from that original sermon, something that was very important in King's words. As King lifted up the critique of white moderation in his sermon, calling out something we should strive not to do, he also gave us an alternative I missed, focusing so much on that one quote. I missed this other alternative that he gave us, something that could fill the void, the yes that goes with the no. Not only did King label the actions and inactions that do harm, but he also offered us the way out. It's more subtle, it's a little harder to pick up, but King recognized the antidote to moderation was to be an extremist for love. I imagine some of you might struggle with the word extremist. I know I certainly do, and King certainly did, and he talks about that even in the letter itself. But he chose to reclaim that word as his response to the status quo of inaction. Speaking to the clergy in that call to unity, he said, and I'm going to share this quote at length. There's so much to it and so much, even parts that I've left out here, but just very powerful. What he says is, he says, "You spoke of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a matter of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I truly believe the greatness of humanity is made apparent in our choices to do amazing things. It might be risking arrest and even physical harm in a protest march. That's certainly possible. But it can occur in so many other ways too. For example, how do you spend your money? How well do you maximize your capacity to give? I just heard a story of a man who walked into a pharmacy and gave them $100 anonymously to be used by people who couldn't afford their prescriptions. And he did this for years. He just kept coming back, giving another $100, another $100, donating over $10,000 in total. He did this all anonymously, and the story didn't come out until he passed away with very little money left to his name. And I heard another story of a man actually right here in Indy who lived a very modest life, was extremely frugal, and upon his death gave away $1 million gifts to more than 10 local charities here in town. Another way that extremism can show up is in that momentary risky decision. When something clearly wrong happens in a moment where we're in group with others, and a silent hush falls over the room, and everyone is afraid to say something. This could be standing up for a vulnerable person in that moment. This could be challenging a bigoted comment. This could be voicing the truth that has not been said. It could be offering an act of kindness to someone who needs it and doesn't expect it. Being an extremist for love, in my mind, means moving yourself, moving ourselves, each of us, closer and closer each day to fully embodying your values. Looking for the places where your life does not fit who you want to be, and taking the steps to get there. This could show up in the food you eat, the way you handle your temper, how you care for your mind and body, becoming a foster parent. Look for the places your life feels out of integrity. I know how this process works. It starts with listening, and it finishes with choices. What are you listening to now? What extreme thing are you being called to now that would help you better align with what you know to be true and to be right? I encourage you, trust yourself, find your greatness, live out an extreme life. Shalom, amen, and blessed be. Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back.